Welcome to the Startup Defense. My name is Callye Keen. Today I have Jesse Levin. Jesse I met Jesse at DEF, and he is the executive director of DEF, and we'll get into what that is and what that does for the community and how it pulls people together to really make an impact and educate and do all these wonderful things in the defense entrepreneurial community. But Jesse, you're also the founder of Tactivate, and I want to get into that mission because these things are pretty deeply interlinked, and you're always up to something interesting. But before we talk about what you're into and how you impact the DC metro region and connect defense entrepreneurs, what are you passionate about?
Well, first, thanks for having me. I know we've been trying to make this happen for a while, so it's great to finally be on the show.
Yeah, I feel like I'm winning. It's been a year in the making. I finally got you on the show.
Look, I think everything that there's a through line through all of our work, and it's really the non-sexy topic, right? It's at the end of the day, it's human capital. It's the human terrain. It's the individuals that we run into both within like the defense innovation community and all the folks that we, kind of meet and work with when we're abroad. And, with all of this going on, with acquisition reform and modernization and, AI and compute and, all of these things, which are tremendously important, I feel like we're really not looking at and innovating around the human element. I don't know that our training pipelines and our institutions are really thinking about how are we going to prepare, for our forces, for force posturing, for the realities of the day. A lot of work that we do is finding the people who are doing the work, who are in country. The units who are very forward leaning, and certainly there are folks who are doing the work and moving very quickly. But for us, it's all about finding the people who are in it, who are high trust, who are the movers and shakers. We can use the term disruptor, and making sure they're connected, right? And there's a really interesting, call it a cohort of folks, within the institution now, and also running around that are prior service that, late 30s, early 40s that have been in Iraq and Afghanistan, have been involved with things like the Afghan evac, have been involved with Ukraine, pairing. I think that the real magic is looking at how we can pair the informal movers and shakers with the folks that are still on the inside of the institution to really be disruptive. And I would say that's kind of our current jam and our biggest passion.
I love it. We're right in the middle of this multi-dimensional touch grass moment. There's a lot of changing policies. There's the new EOs that keep coming out that shift people's attention around, but then there's different international and domestic tensions. There's just so many things happening right now. If I want to navigate any of those problems, human capital is the connective through line of any of those problems, right? If I want to get through, I know I need to reach out to somebody that has done what I'm trying to do, is more knowledgeable about a subject, is at that intersection of what reality is and what perceived reality is. Like, what's that we're at this place where there's a massive conflict, between what somebody wants and how something actually works. So yeah, I really like this about you. You're always talking about bringing people together and solving hard problems, and I really think that's the only way to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, as much as the soft quip, humans over hardware, right? That's kind of like the baseline, and then with all these dual use companies and this like resurgence of VC and this massive surge in national security and defense investing, which is great. There's still the saying, we want to get the best hardware into the warfighter's hands as quickly as possible, right? And of course, we've had issues with that in the past, and that's a very important thing. But I would say, who's really in it, right? Like there's certain, again, like there's people doing the stuff overseas and, in all kinds of places. This is not to imply we don't have anybody anywhere doing these kind of things, but, we don't have a whole lot of folks that are really involved. I think war, the nature of conflict has just drastically shifted, right? I mean, so much of it is economic and in the iosphere. And these are areas that we're clearly working on. But I still see, at least it's our experience from our vantage point, that there's still so much effort, innovation, and dollars being spent on almost a 1.0 perspective, right? On arming and equipping for, a type of engagement that might be anathema to the realities of the time. And, our goal, and like we're kind of always beating our drums, like, hey, how are we training our people? What experience are we giving them in cultivating and understanding how to build informal networks abroad? Are we really showing them how capital is flowing into these, emerging, markets and, what's going on in Eastern Europe? How many folks do we have really, deeply steeped in, in what's going on in China and Russia? And clearly there's, the IC and there's folks involved with it. But generally speaking, I think we've got a lot of work to do in reimagining how we give, our warfighters, hands-on cultural immersion experience and training to really deal with and to understand, what are the tools and the trades that we need for the day, for the threats of the day.
Do you think the broader adoption or interest in those questions has happened as a result of Ukraine, or there are there other forcing functions that are bringing this to light? Because what you're saying is a common conversation now, but I feel like it wasn't a common GWAT conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still very much that. I think it's a conversation. I think it's gotten a lot of airtime. I spent the better part of 2.5 years in Ukraine. I was there. We were there a week after it started. For literally 2.5 years, really watching, doing all kinds of things, but fascinated by and studying the sociocultural aspects of how society that they're really spun up to be able to effectively deter, and looking at tech cycles and looking at decentralized command and looking at the innovation capabilities. And they've really been, at it since 2014. This was kind of like a resurgence of a kind of a kinetic incursion. But as much as the dual use and the VC and the DoD, talks about Ukraine being the ultimate sandbox, again, from our vantage point, we saw, first of all, for a very long time, no one was going into Ukraine because government dollars, weren't flowing. And all the contractors were sitting on the border in Zhezhou, and everyone thought that Ukraine was World War III, and it was just like this insane, place you couldn't go. And in point of fact, it was perfectly safe, right? That's relative, I guess, but you have to really go looking for trouble there. You'd have to go pretty far east. And for those who kind of went and were involved, like Kyiv was a perfectly normal, wonderful place to be. It was manageable and doable. And because there was such a disconnect and so few people that had the ground truth experience, and again, there were people there, but not a whole lot, right? Relatively speaking. When we spun up to really solve the problems and, to do what the US and the entrepreneurial kind of dual use community was doing, is like we were trying to push hardware, and we're still trying to push hardware. And look, I'm invested in a lot of these, these companies. I want them to be successful, these big primes, and I won't name any names, but we were throwing tremendous dollars at solutions that are just getting shoved into a closet and are completely useless, right? And that's a hard pill to swallow. And what needs to be happening is we need to have more people on the ground. And again, this is not a geopolitical conversation. This is not, whether you agree with Ukraine or not. This is, decoupled from that. This is like looking at the evolution of warfare, right? And how resources are flowing. And we saw hundreds of millions of dollars come in to support incredibly kinetic efforts from organizations that you would never think would be involved. Like, that's important, right? We saw the drone schools get stood up and how these guys were training and how they were not only repairing hardware, rapid cycles, but how, the kids were kids. I mean, we're coding, and what enabled the 24-hour tech cycles and turns. Like, that's what we should be supporting if we want to learn and we want to really ingest, the lessons, right? Like, how these groups came together, how they sustain themselves, how true, basically, companies in Ukraine and abroad were adopting units and just supporting them, right? Like, just literally funding them like a sports team. It was wild. And that I think is an element that people don't talk about enough, or maybe pay lip service to, but the vast majority of inertia is still just sending tech hardware into this. Our drone is the best in optical, this, and very little of what we send works, right? That's a very American way, I think, of trying to solve a problem or to try to be supportive.
It was pretty hard for people to hear, hey, we don't want your drones. Right. This conversation has been the impetus for some of the acquisition reforms that we're seeing right now, but also it's launched this whole other conversation about manufacturing at the edge, making at the edge, repair at the edge. And we have a mutual friend, Brad, at Building Momentum. And it makes me think of the classes that Brad has teaching people, hey, here's how to build a drone, and it's not really that I fully think people are going to go out into the field and build drones, but they absolutely need to repair them or modify them or understand how they work, or piece together a broken one from someone else and put it together and be able to use it, and being able to see that play out in real time, where traditionally Eastern Europe has unbelievable engineers, particularly electrical engineers, right? Electronics engineers. It's fantastic, and see that ecosystem where they have manufacturing and they have engineering talent, and then see, to your point, that human capital get deployed for real. For me, coming from engineering and manufacturing, it makes so much sense, but I think that this was a big wake-up call for people. Hey, we can't make things at scale in the US, and we don't have talent for the manufacturing industrial base. And that means that this is doubly, or this is 100x true in services. We don't have people that can make things and build things. It wasn't baked in. We sent people to go do other jobs and let those jobs kind of slip away. And it's not about like, hey, you don't have to go to college, you can become a welder. That's a nice conversation. Maybe a more realistic conversation is, hey, if you're on the other side of the planet and you need to understand how, electrical cabling works or how to repair the connector for your comms gear, it would be really great. So there's a lot to unpack in that conversation. I don't like calling such an important event where people are losing their life as our sandbox.
Right.
Not a big fan of that term, but it is a big wake up call for us is like, look at how fast these people can build these things. We can't do that. What would we do in this situation? It's pretty easy to draw those parallels.
There's so much in there in what you've just said. Like, one, going back to, to Brad, right, and building momentum. My personal opinion is that I think that's one of the greatest like national security treasures we have, and the shop that he's running, the classes that he's in the way they do it. And yes, like, I always view it like there's a value in the allegorical lessons that are being taken from what they teach. Like, I love they run a class for acquisitions folks, right? And they have them build like an electric go-kart in like 5 days or 4 days. And yes, like they're learning the mechanics and all that kind of stuff. But what they're really doing is coming to understand how cheaply and how quickly something can be built. So when they get pitched by the primes, they can like weed through all the noise. Like, well, hold on, that doesn't quite add up, right? And I think it's that approach, right? And that this gets into the bit about, the whole cultural issue we have of folks, not going into the trades, which I think is really shifting right now. And what's fascinating and why I'm incredibly like bullish and optimistic is I think that we're at this flashpoint, right? And I also dislike the term sandbox for Ukraine, but it's kind of like the relevant thing. So it's worth talking about. But I think we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years, out of necessity and out of like a cultural shift, because things in our country, the pendulum tends to swing to the extremes, right? And people, we see a massive desire for folks to want to be of service, to want to be of utility, to want to get involved. And I would argue that we don't necessarily have the most current and modernized pathways to activate that talent group, right? We call it the informal network, right? And this gets kind of into what the Defense Entrepreneurship Forum does. But I think we're going to see a massive shift where there's just a palpable desire to be of more utility, to be, we'll use the term more resilient, to understand that, okay, maybe this profession I've been doing, I'm just like maximizing wealth and, and pick your genre, not to bash any one profession, but banking or whatever. And folks are coming out of it being like, hey, I want to learn to weld. I want to think, how do I fix things, right? And I think, we need that as a country. But, what's fascinating to me is like watching how we had, offshored. And I think, China, as an example, did this very intentionally 30, 40 years ago. We offshored all of our production capabilities even longer. And we're now catching up with this massive capability gap that we have, that we're radically and rapidly trying to make up for. And what the institution, I think, needs to do, and the one piece that we're kind of scratching at the surface at, is I would argue a lot of the skills and subject matter expertise that we need to kind of remain and maintain relevance and effective deterrence and offensive capabilities certainly is within the force. But there's the force structuring, which kind of tampers down a lot of the creative kind of aberrant folks, for the creativity. There's a lot of people on the outside who either have prior service or have never served that are incredibly capable with international networks and cultural experience and connections. And we can find that let's use one of your terms, the nexus, right? How do we combine those worlds together effectively? We're going to get a true whole of society capability and capacity, which is a massive strategic advantage that we have once we can effectively learn to tap that and actualize the creativity that's harnessed, within the private sector. And I don't mean like the defense primes and dual use companies. I mean in the citizenry and the civil populace who are looking to get more involved in national security.
Yeah, I love it. I think one of the purposes of this show, one is to humanize the defense industry. Say, hey, here's my buddy Jesse. Look, he's normal. He's
arguably, I don't know if you can
here's my friend Jesse. Here's somebody that you'd grab a beer with. You'd chit chat about, like, here's guest after guest of people that are interesting and they're doing interesting things and that they're approachable. The industry is much more approachable than outside technologists would initially think that it is. So that's one. But two, people that are looking to solve hard problems. To be honest with you, there's a lot better ways to make money than to work on hard problems in defense. It's not exactly the cash cow that you would think from the news. It is difficult in many domains. But if you want to solve important, difficult problems, it is the best space to be in my opinion. But I've already made my decision.
But I would also say, like, to your first point, like the people, look, I've been a quote unquote entrepreneur my entire life, right? I've been in the nightlife space. I've opened climbing gyms and co-working spaces, and you pick your weird venture, and we've been involved with it. I have never ever come across a group of warmer, more intelligent, kind, empathetic people ever than I have in this arena, right? I mean, pick the Brads, the Jay Longs, the Ivanahus, the Jen Savadas, there's just the Jared McCoys. Like, there's people that just really viscerally care, right? And that's so refreshing. And I think it gets this negative stigma because when you equate anything to defense or DoD, people automatically assume you're a warmonger or you're far right or whatever. And that couldn't be any farther from the truth. I mean, these are some of the most intellectually switched on, curious, kind, folks we have in our country, right? And they've made that choice to just commit themselves to this arena. And I think people would be really pleasantly surprised from an intellectual perspective, from a purpose perspective, when they dip their toe in to see who's running around in the space, because it is wild.
Yeah, that's just part of opening the door to tap that human capital that the U.S. does have. Think of high-end research, and I see some of these kids on the robotics teams that we sponsor, like what they're able to just build effectively for fun. I mean, I know that they've got their tiger parents saying, hey, you got to get on this team and win. But I'm blown away what a 14 and 15-year-old can do when they're switched on. And I wish that they could see and say, yeah, I'm going to work on unmanned systems or specialty robotics, or I'm going to work on network transport because I know all of this type of wireless. And I think more and more people are looking at the industry as a place to go versus everybody's just going to get funneled to Facebook and work on a little piece of nothing that no one will ever care about in 5 years. But it is astonishing to see that interest coming back, right? Is like of making things, building things, inventing things, and like it coming, at least from my perspective, right, Jesse, is like this long perspective of manufacturing is a very silent business. It's everywhere. It's the largest industry because it can mean so many things, but it does. There's no like manufacturing marketing, right? It's not like in your face. It's just silently everywhere. And now, because of the rise of automation, because of what's happening in Ukraine, and now because of acquisition reform and defense tech startups and hard tech startups are now popular as well. There's this confluence of things happening where I feel like we have this chance of activating those networks of people that might in the past have gone and worked for Ford. And now, just like in World War II, everybody decided, okay, we're not making cars, we're making tanks. We're not doing this, we're doing that. But not that we should make tanks, we should actively not make them. But you know what I'm saying is like, we're at this point where I feel like we can tap that human element. And there's a place for organizations like DEF to come in and act as like a pathfinder or a connector for people that are interested in getting involved.
One of the most important things, as we've discussed, is again the human element, right? And I think there's a lot that needs to be done in that arena. And I think you're a great example. It's this conversation what you just said. I'm really excited about. We were talking about Emily Gold earlier. We can't say, I guess, exactly what she's doing, but there are people in the arena who are working very hard on changing the narrative, right, and making sure that it lands differently. And I think that's so important. I think to really facilitate this cultural zeitgeist, it's very much a marketing and branding and PR effort. And, I think that's why folks like Alexis Bonnell and, just the Justin Finellis of the world are so successful, is because they're just so clear on their mission, and they humanize, and they really bring like guerrilla marketing tactics into their message, right? There are these types of folks that, no matter what, like if you're, I don't want to say there's like an inner circle, right? But if you're doing the work and you're a doer in the community, you can call upon the community and they will pick up the phone and they'll get behind you, right? I call you for weird stuff, every once in a while. And I think that's what people are missing. What DEF is all about, and why I'm so passionate about DEF is, I'm a civilian. I've worked very closely, with the soft community and, for a very long time, but I've always been a civilian, and I have never found a platform that affords a point of entry and access like DEF. Right. So irrespective if you're a flag officer, general officer, or lance corporal, or NGO guy, or academic, or manufacturer, or dual use tech, it doesn't matter. If you have a vested interest in like positively disrupting the status quo and getting involved, whether it's from an academic perspective or otherwise, like DEF will provide you a platform to intersect that world, right? To kind of gain a foray into what is national security. And I think we need that now more than ever. And then there's kind of like a self-selecting community within DEF, where it's a pretty large, nebulous, we call it the virtuous insurgency. And hey, whether I'm in the Philippines or Haiti or Ukraine, like the first group I'm tapping is the DEF network, because we've got people everywhere, both on the inside and the outside, that are incredibly connected and experienced. And that needs to grow. But there's also like this tight core, where you pick up the bat phone and these folks can move mountains. We always like to say, we have the folks who can run around outside the institution at the called the tippy end of the spear, running around these places like Ukraine where the institution maybe can't go. But when you have the top cover from the folks who are still in, who understand what's going on and what they're doing, you can connect those two, because you don't get that anaphylaxis reaction from the institution when they're like, who are these wahoos running around? What are they doing? When you have the folks on the inside connected with the folks on the outside who are doing the work that this group necessarily can't do, and you make that connection, and I think it requires a bit of an informal actor to do that, it's a very potent capability. And so we always like to say, informal networks are a strategic capability or a weapon system. And we're really hard at work at cultivating and growing the virtuous insurgency, as it were.
All we have to do is switch from Slack over to Signal. I think we'll have a lot more real-time engagement.
Like, we're in the process of doing all kinds of revamps with DEF, but Slack is dead. Like, don't expect an active Slack group. Like, there's no one there. Thank God.
This is like that's just like a gentle joke, but Jesse knows, like everybody's on Signal all the time. So no, I think that really sums up DEF very well. Where can we find more information if somebody is interested in getting involved, going to an event? Like, when and where are events, and where can I get information?
Yeah, so the website's pretty janky at the moment. We're actually about to do like a massive, which we're really excited about, kind of calling it DEF 2.0. Because that's been around for 11 years now. And quite frankly, the initial mission, which was launched for, we've kind of grown out of, right? The system, the innovation ecosystem has matured, and what DEF was initially set out to do, that's no longer like the most relevant mission set for us. So the website is going to be kind of drastically revamped. But def.org, you can find we have Agoras, which are local chapters, kind of DEF folks that we call them drinking things. They meet up and they hang out. We've got a pretty active one in DC. There's one standing up in North Carolina in Bragg. We've got a group relaunching one in Colorado. San Francisco's coming online. DC is very active. New York is very active. So you can find info there. But quite frankly, like honestly, DEF, it's a weird beast, right? You get what you put into it, right? It's not like this organization that puts out a ton of content, and we're not great at social media, and we're not great at monitoring the Slack channel. But for folks who really lean in, as an example, there's two DEF guys who met at an Agora meeting, a couple, maybe a month and a half, 2 months ago in New York, and they both went over to Ukraine together and completely changed the trajectory of the product that they were working, right? Just because of the serendipity and the collision point. So there's a lot of value in ROI if you lean in and are aggressive about just getting involved. But it's not like a website you're going to go and be like, oh my God, this is a treasure trove of information, and I'm going to go to these guys because it's going to facilitate my next SIBR or OTA. Like that's not what DEF's about. The
first Agora that I went to, I walked in and I was like, okay, I know a third of these people already. Like, this is a good place, because now, well, one, I feel more comfortable. It's like, hey, I know a few of these people. These are my people. And then everybody said, hey, here's what I'm up to. Everybody's up to something different. It's not like all VCs or all startups or like, all people that are in service. It's odd mix of characters. And so when we went over a topic, everybody had pretty strong opinions, but from completely different perspectives. So even if we were saying the same thing, we said it differently enough where it brought, thoughts to new light. I think that's fairly unique, right? We're all used to like going to demo days or like going to panel discussions, but it would be much better to just go like meet a new friend who's working on a different but similar problem as you, right? So I find that fascinating. But
Yeah, and that's my personally my favorite part about Def is like the cast of characters, like the eclectic nature of the community is really refreshing, right? Because you do get your standard fare folks, and like that you get like the professionals, or I guess who this is their profession, right? But what's so important, as you just mentioned, is outside perspective, and certainly with like DIU and Ensign and on ramps and all these things that now exist, like there's clearly more of that happening. But I think there's a gazillion and one ways to really amplify that. You know, someone explained this to me. I guess I'd said this, and I heard someone parrot it back at actually a DC event recently, and they said, what they love about DEF is it just really increases the surface area for serendipity and national security, right? So whether you're meeting an academic or an artist or a scientist or a techie or whatever, those collision points and perspectives really are valuable. I get people who are thinking a different way or plugged into a different resource community. And it's that collective capability and capacity that is a tremendous reach back capability, which is what we think DEF is.
Jesse, I really appreciate you taking the time to finally be on the Startup Defense. I got you. So
thanks for having me.
My name is Callye Keen, and this has been the Startup Defense.